Hello, I'm Gil Zilkha. Welcome to my channel, Essential Classical Music, where we look at the best recordings of the standard classical music repertoire. This video is taken out of my larger video on the great conductors and their best recordings. I hope you enjoy it. And the first conductor I'm going to talk about is one who is very revered as well as very controversial, and that's Wilhelm Furtwängler, a German conductor, very much a creature of the late Romantic era, a composer himself who was likened in his style to Bruckner. And he is definitely one who, if you were to put on the, fit on the spectrum of listening, he tends to be more, he takes greater liberties. He thought through the scores in a way that he was very adamant about not simply doing what he thought as just taking dictation and reciting back the music, but internalizing it and sort of like an actor on a stage, then acting it out in a way that sounded natural to him, as well as the people who still revere him today. That being said, others will hear it and they'll think that he's taking too many liberties and that he's personalizing or individualizing the music in a way that takes you away from the music. Furtwängler would say the opposite. He would say, "This is my natural intuition." So it's all again in the eye of the beholder. What you can't deny is that Furtwängler made a name for himself, particularly in the German standard repertoire. And really the starting place with Furtwängler is always in Beethoven. Particularly the Beethoven works that were more epic. And so I'm going to recommend for Furtwängler in Beethoven the third, the Eroica, the fifth, and the ninth. The third, his recording from 1952. Another thing about Furtwängler now I want to say, he was a very intuitive conductor who, he didn't like being too constricted. So he didn't do as well in the studio. He was a little bit more stale in the studio and became more unbuttoned live. So most of the recordings I'm going to recommend are his live recordings. And by the way, that's another thing about Furtwängler that is a reason I thought this would be a good video, is because there's so many for a guy who didn't make it to the stereo era. He has so many recordings out there, some that are the same recording on different labels. So it's a lot to sift through. In general, I would say I tend towards the live performances. And so for the Eroica, his December 8th, 1952 recording, I think is the one that shows him at his most inspired and powerful and profound. It's also an excellent sound for its time. You can get it on a Tara issue. You can also find it in this box from Audite, which I will come back to because it's got a lot of the same recordings that I'm going to recommend in this Furtwängler batch. The sound quality is pretty good in both of them. I would say that the Tara is a little bit smoother and cleaner. It makes it a little bit more comfortable listening, but they're both very good. Now, for the fifth, there are two recordings that I recommend. These are both post-war recordings. One is from 1947. That was actually his first recording he made after the war, returning to Berlin. This was May 25th, 1947. And the excitement of being back in Berlin again with his people conducting again was palpable. It's just for Furtwängler one of his more spontaneous and inspired interpretations. I've talked before about the coda at the very end. This was a sort of a Furtwängler special. He wasn't metronomic. And he does a little accelerando speeding up towards the end, and it really makes it particularly exciting in this case. Now, he also has one from his last year of life, 1954. This was May 23rd, 1954, which is slower, better recorded though, and it just has that granite-like power that we associated with the Berlin Philharmonic under Furtwängler. So that one's also special for that reason. Both of these you can find on Tara as well as Audite. This is a release that has the 1947 recording coupled with a very good pastoral. This one, same double disc that has that Aroque I just mentioned. This is the 1954 recording, also with the Pastoral, also excellent. I tend to prefer this Pastoral because it's even more evocative of the pastoral kind of mood. That's also an excellent Furtwängler interpretation. However, you get all of these in this box. So economically, it's not a bad idea to just go for the Audite box. Even though I would still say, if you're going to be really picky, I prefer the smoothness of the Tara sound. Anyway, so that is the third and the fifth. However, when you're talking about Furtwängler and Beethoven, well, Furtwängler in general, the work with which he's most associated with is the ninth. The epic scale of the ninth, the inspiration of it, is really tailor-made for someone like Furtwängler, who aspired for such things on the podium. For me personally, this is where I hear the ninth really spread its wings and do its thing in terms of just the full extent of the emotions, the intensity and the ferocity of that opening movement, the stillness and transcendence of the adagio, and then the fury, and then finally the joy that comes out, in that finale. For me, the first recording I come to that I recommend for this one is his famous 1951 Bayreuth recording. This is the release of the official recording. The EMI has some cuts of rehearsals, so it's not exactly official, although you're essentially getting still the same performance. It is not the best recording quality. The choir sounds a little bit recessed, but the interpretation is really just wonderful, just intense, very, very spiritual, and it gives you what you need to know about Furtwängler's interpretation of the Beethoven Ninth. However, I would say that for me, more of a desert island choice is going backwards to a rougher recording that is even more intense and just even more nails it in terms of the extreme of the emotions that you find in this work. And that's the 1942 Berlin Philharmonic recording from March of 1942. That, even though it's rough sounding, it's a fairly good recording quality for a live 1942 recording. The choir sounds very strong, and they just let it all hang loose in that finale. So for the intensity of the emotions, I would say this complements the Bayreuth recording. So I would say start with that one, but also hear this one. And then finally, if recording quality is more important to you, there is a much better recorded version from 1954, just I think it was 2 or 3 months before he died, at the Lucerne Festival. So this is with the Philharmonia. It's very well played, very well recorded. It's not like, he's not like on the verge of death, so it's well conducted. But I would say to my ears, you can hear a little bit of slackening of tension compared to those earlier recordings. However, you might even say it has a greater spirituality to it, especially in the adagio and when the Ode to Joy theme makes its slow entrance in the final movement. So it's got all sorts of qualities, both sonic and in terms of the interpretation, that also make it a valid complement to those other recordings. Now, that's Beethoven. Furtwängler, of course, was steeped in the German Romantic repertoire, which means that you have to follow Beethoven with Brahms, and what better symphony to follow Beethoven with than the Beethoven 10th, otherwise known as the Brahms First. And that is one that Furtwängler not only left us a really powerful, intense interpretation, but a very good sounding one for its time, for a live recording. This is the 1951 North German radio recording. It shows all of Furtwängler's gifts for flexibility, the way he builds, for example, that climax at the end of the first movement, just brings it to a crawl, and then slowly it starts to increase, and then just this really powerful climax. So that's just an example of what he brings. And really, of all the Brahms symphonies, I would say, because it has that Beethoven power to it, it's really kind of tailor-made for Furtwängler's style. Now, next among the German Romantic bees, we come to Bruckner, who in many ways, some might feel, as I mentioned earlier, as a composer, he was close spiritually to Bruckner, and some might feel that he was even more suited to Bruckner's to music in terms of the epicness and so on. And that said, that I think that Bruckner's most epic symphony, just like the Beethoven Ninth, the Bruckner Eighth is the one where we find Furtwängler really stretching it to its limits in terms of intensity, and then that beautifully spiritual adagio that's so central to the piece. This is of his, I believe there are 3 live recordings. This is the one that I recommend. It's from 1944. Recorded with the Vienna Philharmonic, and recorded fairly well. It's not noisy at all. It's fairly clean. By the way, this is a music and arts issue. There is one that's come out recently from a label called I think it's Musical Concepts, that has as good a sound for this as I've heard. So I recommend that one highly. I believe it's also shown up on Deutsche Grammophon, on Tara, and even Orfeo, which might even be the best sounding of all. I think that's like in a big box. Regardless, you'll find it somewhere, and I think you will find it very rewarding for the intensity of the conception. Now, last but not least, among German Romantic composers for whom Furtwängler was well known, we have to mention Wagner. Again, one that roughly contemporaneous with Bruckner, is one that people even see as more just perfectly suited to Furtwängler in terms of his extremes of expressive emotion. And once again, you have to take the epic masterpiece and look at that as something that Furtwängler did especially well. And in this case, we're lucky to have a studio recording that even Furtwängler himself liked, which was very rare for him. And that's Tristan und Isolde. This is the proverbial classic of the gramophone, recorded in the early 50s. It's still in mono, but it's very good sounding mono, produced by Walter Legg. You've got the incomparable Kirsten Flagstad singing the part of Isolde, past her prime, but still sounding beautiful. You've got Ludwig Suthaus as Tristan. Just the production values are wonderful, and it's always been one of the reference recordings for Tristan and Isolde. Just profoundly emotional. The love duet in the second act is just gorgeously phrased, and it just feels like you're levitating as you hear it. So can't recommend this one highly enough. Now, another opera that Furtwängler was known for, with a composer that maybe you would think, is not such, the opposite of, say, Wagner or Bruckner, someone going back to the classical period, Mozart. Furtwängler conducted all of Mozart's operas in Salzburg, but the one that he was most suited to is, I think, the darkest of them, Don Giovanni, the most Beethoven sounding, especially with the twin pillars of that death scene of the commendatore in the beginning, and then the resurrection or the reappearance of the commendatore at the end. Very, very powerful in Furtwängler's hands. He does have 3 live Salzburg performances that are on record, they're all very good. I recommend the 1953 recording with Cesare Siepi as the Don, and then you have also Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, Elizabeth Krummer, Otto Edelman, Walter Berry. So just your vintage Salzburg cast for the time period. And just wonderfully conducted by Furtwängler. For some people, again, for Mozart, it might sound heavy, it might sound too dark, might sound too slow. I think it fits the piece really well, and at the very least, it's well worth investigating. He did do one with a virtually identical cast the following year that was even filmed. This one, I think, is the more alert, exciting one. Little difference in that regard, but that one is better recorded. So some people may prefer it for that reason. I tend to recommend the 53 more. Now, also among German romantics, we have Schubert, another composer that Furtwängler was well known for, and again, his epic work, the Great Symphony in C, number 9. That is one that we have several recordings of from Furtwängler. But again, we're lucky to have a studio version. One of his most acclaimed recordings from 1951. Recorded by Deutsche Grammophon with the Berlin Philharmonic. He brings that power and that knowledge of the score that just ties it all together and really makes it a powerful experience. I will say that I slightly prefer a live recording from a couple of years later, also with the Berlin Philharmonic, that is very well recorded for live performance. This one is, in terms of performance quality, I slightly prefer this one, even though it's live and there's a little bit of noise. You do get a wonderful version of the Schubert Unfinished Symphony as well with this one. Now, of course, though, with this one, you also get, at least in this originals issue, you get the Haydn Symphony number 88, which, even though, again, you wouldn't associate Furtwängler with the classical repertoire as much, he does a wonderful Haydn 88. It's got wonderful rhythmic bounce to it. It sounds very free, and it's not overblown and overly romantic. So they really are both worth investigating. Next, let's talk about Tchaikovsky, who, although Russian, was definitely a composer who modeled himself after the standard German symphonists. And stop me if you've heard this before, but his most epic work is one that once again showed Furtwängler at his best. That, of course, is his 6th symphony, the Pathétique. And this is one that Furtwängler not only brought drama to, he just that wonderful dramatic pacing of knowing how to shift the gears in just the right way to bring it to an incredible climax. For example, listen to that third movement. It's just incredible. And then the power at the end of the final movement. But he also brought this nobility, this eloquence as well. For this one, we have a very famous recording from the 30s that was recorded in the studio. With the Berlin Philharmonic. And ironically enough, it sounds cleaner than this one, which is from 1951, also with the Berlin Philharmonic, but this one was recorded live in Cairo, so it's a little bit noisy, a little bit, it's not nearly as clean, although there is more presence to this one. They're both worth hearing. I would say this one, the 1951 recording, is more overtly emotional and exciting. But you still have that wonderful nobility and grandeur here, and maybe better proportions. So they're both worth hearing. So another wonderful interpretation from Furtwängler. And then finally, I'm going to mention one more, the Schumann Fourth. Of course, this is a composer from the middle of the German Romantic period that you'd expect Furtwängler to excel in. The Fourth Symphony of Schumann is the one that he recorded. He also has a Spring Symphony that you can find as well. But the fourth is the one that it's one of the most universally praised of Furtwängler recordings, maybe the best sounding recording he ever made. It's still mono, but it's very passable mono, and he was steeped in this tradition, so everything just sounds natural. The romanza, the second movement, the way he phrases it, it just sounds like one breath from the beginning, extending throughout the movement. And that's one of the things that Furtwängler was so gifted at in these slow movements. Then he has this, like in the Beethoven Fifth, he has a wonderful, exciting transition between the third and the fourth movements. So another Furtwängler interpretation that you can't go wrong with. Thanks for watching. I want to wish you all a great day and happy listening.